Hello my dear friends and welcome to another episode of Europa Rediviva. I decided to take on a challenge. I received some objections, some rather lengthy objections from a viewer, and I decided to take them on and to try to give an answer, an elaborate answer in video format, because there's a lot to unpack. These questions come from somebody from across the aisle, from somebody who has essentially the opposite point of view. And of course, in order to be able to answer some objections, there are a lot of premises that need to be explained, some underlying premises, because the disagreement between, let's say, the mainstream point of view and my point of view comes from a lot of pre-assumed things, a lot of assumptions, a lot of presuppositions, which are underlying and which are most of the times unconscious. So I'm going to try to unpack these things. I'm probably going to do several episodes because there's really a lot to unpack. There's no easy answer. This is the problem. So, the comment is in Romanian. I'm going to translate his position, and the first thing that he says is that he listened to John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, and he did not have the impression that they were talking bullshit. Sure, I've had the same experience trying to, let's say, open the eyes of some people that were close to me. I gave them Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer to listen to. And the people who were very much caught by the American paradigm were not moved by the credentials of these people because, of course, a lot of people say a lot of things, and Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer have some sort of a contrarian point of view, even though they do not have the same point of view. I can elaborate on that. And they can be informative if you're somehow maybe on the fence. But if you're a die-hard supporter of the mainstream American point of view, the psychological tendency to dismiss them as propaganda will probably override any type of reason. So my experience is that when people are offered the contrary point of view, their opinions do not change. Because their opinions, first of all, have been set in their current position after decades of build-up from this propaganda machine that the mainstream media functions as. And you cannot overturn that just by offering a different point of view, even if that point of view comes from credentialed people and comes with a lot of arguments. Because in order to be able to assess those arguments, you need a lot of knowledge that you don't have. Because if you had it, you would not need the Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer to come and open your eyes. In my case, for example, I tried to give the example of these people to friends of mine who were caught in this mass formation because of their credentials. So they do not have exactly the same point of view, John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is a multilateralist. He works for the United Nations, first and foremost. He's also an employee of the Columbia University, but that does not define his view upon the world. His view is more that of a development economist, which works for the United Nations and which works for various governments. And this shaped his view. So he's a multilateralist. He's not bound to the interests of the American empire. He's not bound to the interests of Israel, even though he's Jewish and so on. John Mearsheimer is something rather different. This is why also their opinions do not converge. Their opinions of the Ukraine war seem somehow similar, but John Mearsheimer, on the other hand, is an imperialist. He is an American imperialist. He's an American exceptionalist. He does want the United States to dominate across the board, so he's not necessarily a neocon in the sense that he doesn't have this sort of Israel first ambition. The neocons were Zionists as well, and these things got conflated. The interests of Israel and the interests of the United States, they got conflated. This is why we had all the wars in the Middle East. His take is that the United States should rule the Western Hemisphere, so he's a fan of the Monroe Doctrine, and it should take on China, which is America's main rival. So, for example, if this war was in Taiwan, Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer would not have the same opinion. John Mearsheimer would be one of the proponents of the war, whereas Jeffrey Sachs would be one of the opponents of the war. It's not like they are on the same page. It just so happens that for practical reasons, for pragmatic reasons, it stayed set in stone in the realist paradigm of the United States that Russia and China should not be allowed to cooperate ever since the Sino-Soviet split, which was instrumented by Kissinger, and the United States sided with China against the Soviet Union. Brzezinski wrote in the Grand Chessboard that that Russia and China should not be allowed to cooperate, and this is John Mearsheimer's view as well. He believes that Russia should be made a partner of the West by respecting its red lines, and this group of, let's say, white countries or Western countries, including Russia, should take on China because China is the main rival of the United States. So in order to ensure US primacy, I don't know how you could frame it, the collective West, including Russia, should make sure that China stays down in order not to overtake the United States. This is the view that John Mearsheimer has. So he is for defending Taiwan, or at least he was when he started doing these public commentaries after the start of the war in Ukraine. I give them as examples because of their credentials, because John Mearsheimer is the highest figure of the realist school. He's a University of Chicago professor, but he is very respected in the field of international relations theory because he has this entire theory. He's basically the theoretician, the main theoretician of the realist school. Jeffrey Sachs is very respected as a development economist, and actually I did not come across them ever since the war in Ukraine started. I knew both of them for many years. For example, I posted on my channel maybe 3 weeks ago a short clip in which I asked John Mearsheimer a question. That was in 2018. I was already a fan of John Mearsheimer's work back in 2018, so that's 4 years before the Ukraine war started. I've known the work of Jeffrey Sachs even 10 years before that, because I studied economics at the University of Groningen, and there in a course, in a development economics course, we also became acquainted with his work. Incidentally, I dated a girl who went on to Columbia University and who studied with him, and we were members of the same student association as Oana Tsoiu, the current foreign minister of Romania. We were in the same generation, in the same student association in Bucharest. Jeffrey Sachs is not somebody that I heard of ever since the war in Ukraine started and he educated me. No. This is why I'm also doing this channel in English. I've given up on trying to convince anybody. I'm not trying to convince anybody anymore because people cannot be convinced. If I could not convince the people around me that I'm not crazy, then I have no chance of convincing random Romanians by elaborating my points in Romanian. I've come to the conclusion that it's a lost cause. What I'm doing is I'm trying to enter into dialogue with people who already have this opinion and to try to develop some new ideas, starting from the common set of assumptions that we already share and from the information pool that we have already acquired. But for me, it's futile to believe that opinions can be changed. This was also shown to me during the pandemic. I tried to convince people that the virus is coming, which was quite an obvious thing, and I saw that people cannot be made to believe what they do not want to believe. Then I've tried to convince people that the vaccine is experimental and that it has several problems as they came in the medical literature, in the pharmacovigilance databases as safety signals. And yeah, my experience was also that you cannot convince people that do not want to be convinced, and their gut reaction will override any kind of rational response. So instead of approaching this matter as this guy is not an idiot, this guy says he's read some things, let's see what he read, maybe it makes some sense. No, the reaction was rejection and labeling. Anti-vaxxer. Anti-science. You're uneducated. This or that. Because incidentally, I had done quite a lot of statistics courses in my economics training up to that point, and also in my work, to be able to understand the methodological pitfalls that some papers in the COVID literature were facing, and I could notice how the discourse was manipulated with academic papers in medicine. And actually most doctors have very little training in statistics and in methodology in general, and they just read the abstract of the medical paper and the conclusions, and they take the conclusions for granted. And there was a lot of manipulation being done in the medical journals. Papers who were critical of the vaccine and who were showing evidence that either that it doesn't work or that it's harmful were being withdrawn. So very few of them were admitted for publishing, and they were subsequently withdrawn because of outcry. There was a hysteria also in the medical profession, and there was outcry and like, how dare you? You are giving ammunition to the anti-vaxxers and so on. Whereas all sorts of bullshit papers with huge methodological flaws were published in prestigious journals, and many practitioners were not aware of these pitfalls, because you need to have had quite a lot of statistics in order to understand to understand what to avoid, and in order to understand what traps you may fall into, and what traps can statisticians set for you. Anyway. So I've given up on the idea that people can be convinced. Also, my endeavors, I went to 5 podcasts in Romanian, and I started being labeled and having defamatory posts about me, and then subsequently being on this assassination website. So I do not think I can derive any kind of benefit by expressing myself in Romanian and targeting the Romanian audience, the Romanian information space, other than just being labeled and threatened. So I don't think I can convince Romanians of anything, because as I said, I could not even convince people who already knew me and who had, I hope, a good impression of me. So this being said, I am very, very much aware of how the human mind operates, and how we fall into these biases, and how we do not function rationally, and therefore how it is it's impossible to believe that you can actually convince people of your point of view on a matter that they hold the opposite point of view, and they hold it for decades. As my commentator also writes, listening to John Marsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs has helped me to wake up a bit from the hubris of pro-American brainwashing in which I was raised. Yeah, same with me. I was also raised in the pro-American brainwashing. But my commentator says, but I do not regret the pro-American brainwashing, because the Soviet brainwashing is infinitely worse. I don't know if it's infinitely worse. First of all, the Soviet Union existed for 70 years. When we speak about Soviet propaganda, what exactly do we mean? Which layer, which target group, on which subject, which period? I can imagine that Bolshevik propaganda of the 1920s was different than perestroika propaganda of the 1980s. So, I don't know. For me, this assessment cannot be qualified. I have no idea if Soviet propaganda was worse. But anyway, the Soviet Union stopped existing for 35 years now. So I don't know if we should compare American propaganda to Soviet propaganda, maybe to Russian propaganda, but also if we take Russian propaganda. In order to have an opinion about Russian propaganda, you should be exposed to it. You should actually go and read the Russian point of view. You should go on Russian websites. not on Russian diaspora websites, not on Medusa or on, I don't know, Moscow Times from Amsterdam. Medusa is from Latvia. No, I mean like official Russian press. Read the op-eds, read the elaborate point of view of the Russians, and then make up your mind about their point of view. You cannot make up your mind regarding the Russian point of view by reading how it is reflected in the Western media, because it is reflected in a very biased way. For example, Putin never threatened to nuke the West. In Western media, there were a lot of such claims, but those statements by Putin were made in a different fashion. He was just pointing out the fact that Russia has a security system and has a nuclear doctrine, and that nuclear doctrine is activated when the country is in danger of disappearing, even in conventional ways. Not to mention that the United States has a first strike doctrine and the Russian Federation has a second strike doctrine. But the Russian Federation also has in its nuclear doctrine the fact that it can respond nuclearly in case the existence of the state is threatened. So therefore, to try to ensure a conventional defeat automatically builds up to the use of nuclear weapons. There's no way to go around it. So basically, Russia was saying either we win conventionally or we will use nuclear weapons, but this is not a threat issued in the context of this war. It was just a reiteration of the fact that this is what the nuclear doctrine of Russia says, and this is why a country equips itself with nuclear weapons. Also, America would not allow itself to have a part of it invaded, as there was this invasion done by Ukraine in Kursk and Belgorod regions. It would not even allow Chinese and Russian bases in Mexico or in Canada, but let alone being attacked, having its capital attacked, and so on and so forth. It would use nuclear weapons from the start. I mean, the United States used nuclear weapons on Japanese civilians after it firebombed like 40 cities in the Second World War, when it faced no danger from Japan. It was just a matter of expediting its capitulation. But the United States, of course, would use nuclear weapons, and it would obliterate any kind of enemy that would constantly attack its oil infrastructure, its civilians, cities, and all sorts of things. So the Russian point of view, which might be called Russian propaganda, is something that first needs to be known in order to be critiqued. If you just say, well, Russian propaganda is worse, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but make sure you read it. Make sure you get acquainted with the Russian point of view before saying that it is worse than the American one. And then, your conclusions are a leap of faith. This is what he tells me, and then he goes on to ask, so why do you allege that this war is upheld by the United States, whereas the Trump administration stopped offering weapons and intelligence to the Ukrainians for almost 2 years, and that it was a guarantor for the Minsk Accords? Well, not really. So he's saying that the United States were a guarantor for the Minsk Accords in exchange for the Ukrainian renunciation of nuclear weapons. I think he's referring to the Treaty of Budapest of 1994, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal to Russia in exchange for security guarantees. The Minsk agreements were guaranteed by France and Germany. I don't think the US was also a guarantor of the Minsk agreements. But anyway, the Minsk agreements were not implemented by the Ukrainian side, because the Minsk agreements were meant to give autonomy to the Donbass and to recognize Crimea as a Russian territory. And even though Ukraine signed them, and even though there were these guarantor powers that also signed them, they were only meant to buy time, as both François Hollande and Angela Merkel admitted. And They were not implemented by the Ukraine side, which chose war. So why do I say that this war is upheld by the United States? Well, because the decision-making centers which plan the strikes on Russian territory are in American bases in Germany. This is something that also the New York Times reported, in Greifswald and in Hamburg, and I don't remember where. And because the intel and the satellite imagery and all these things are still provided by the United States, so it's not true that the Trump administration is no longer offering intel. It is offering intel. And regarding weapons, no, because the Trump administration and the United States managed to outsource the war. So the Trump administration, the dominant strategy for the United States was from the beginning to make proxies fight. So the Trump administration just makes the Europeans buy the weapons, and then the Europeans donate the weapons to Ukraine. Of course, the United States are supporting the war because it is very favorable for them. It is something that they make a profit out of. The American weapons manufacturers, the weapons industry, of course, for them the war is very lucrative. And this is why politically, the United States supports the war, because the United States would not want the Europeans to stop the war. On the contrary, the United States wants the Europeans to be as involved as possible in this war and to buy the weapons from the United States. This is the dominant strategy, and the US is getting it. It is something that the US worked for. Where it worked on distancing Europe and especially Germany from Russia, as they were collaborating in the energy sphere. And for example, the blowing up of Nord Stream was also part of this. Joe Biden, together with Olaf Scholz, in this press conference in January 2022, made the statement that Nord Stream would no longer exist in case Russia invaded, and Russia did invade. So therefore, Nord Stream stopped existing, which was in the interest of the United States, because now the United States is selling liquefied natural gas to the Europeans. Essentially, as there was this adage by the Bolsheviks, that the capitalists will sell, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. This was the adage of the Bolsheviks. Essentially, the United States has unloaded the burden of the proxy war in its interest to the Europeans, and the United States is essentially selling the Europeans the weapons for their own demise. The Europeans are waging this war against their own interest. Their interest was collaboration with Russia, just like they did for decades in the energy sector and so on. And there was the security framework in Europe, the Organization for Security and Collaboration in Europe, the consequence of the Helsinki Accords and so on. And there was this pan-European security framework, which the United States had the interest to break, and which it did break. And the United States managed to get the Europeans to be clients of the US LNG industry. The US LNG industry was uncompetitive. It had no clients, and the only way to obtain clients was to bomb trade routes, to bomb pipelines. So basically, to make the suppliers of gas, like Iran, like Venezuela, like Russia, and so on, to make them unable to supply to their customers, to alienate their customers, or to block the trade routes, and so on. And this is what the United States has been doing in the past years. So, of course, this war is upheld by the United States in every way possible, and Trump's rhetoric was just that. It was just hot air, and it was just... maybe he had some intentions of stopping it, I have no idea, but as Putin said, all presidents have ideas, but then people in blue suits come and explain to them how things should be done, and then you have continuity of agenda. So that's that. I've gone on for quite a while, so I think I will address the other 10 points in other episodes, but this is kind of like what I would like to do. So I don't believe that dialogue can change anybody's point of view, but perhaps it could be demonstrative for people who are on the fence, So yeah, I don't think dialogue works. There's this Iranian channel, Dialogue Works, with Nima Al-Koravit, or what his name is, who is a civil engineer who studies in Brazil, and he takes these people who are from the same side of the debate, because you cannot really debate with the other side, because yeah, there are different underlying values. Somebody from the other side would just call me a Putin puppet, and I would call him a USAID grant recipient, and that would be the end of the dialogue. There is no actual debate possible to bridge such a huge gap. But this is what I wanted to tell you. I will come back with my refutations of these objections in subsequent episodes. And until next time, if you want to support my work, like, share, subscribe. You'll find the link in the description of the channel how to support me financially. Take care and goodbye.